1 second. This cafe can hear.
Hello and good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is James Anderson. I'm with the FSB and delighted to welcome you all to this webinar this morning. Today we're going to be hearing about understanding and reducing your carbon footprint. We have got brilliant speakers today it's John and Chris from Auditel. Auditel at their sort of heart are a cost reduction company. So fantastic for small business owners like yourselves in that, you know, the core of business of getting more sales and reducing your costs. It's really essential. And yeah, just really looking forward to hearing what they're going to say today. In terms of questions throughout the talk, it's a little Q&A box that you can see. So do put your questions in there. The chat is closed, but questions in there. We've got plenty of time at the end for questions. So as and when they pop into your brain, do stick them in there and we'll come to them at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to John and Chris.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can see me now. I think I hadn't been unmuted and my video going. Thanks very much for that, James. So my name's John Gerard. I'm from Auditel. I'll be talking to you today about understanding and reducing your carbon footprint. Yeah, Auditel is a company has about 70 to 100 cost and carbon experts scattered around the country, yeah, who form a network to mutually support each other in delivering cost reduction programs and carbon programs to our customers. Yeah, so our mission in terms of carbon is to help organizations become carbon neutral in a measurable, meaningful, and potentially self-funding way. And what you'll see is I'll return to that theme throughout the presentation. Yeah. So I'll be running the presentation. Chris will be joining me afterwards for the Q&A. So let's get started. Okay, so sorry about that, a little bit of technical problem, but here we go. Right, so a bit of admin first. So the agenda today is to look at demystifying the carbon jargon. So like any industry, the carbon industry has its own language, yeah, and it can be terribly confusing. Yeah, so I'll look towards demystifying at least some of that, the key language, and why SMEs are vital to the UK's carbon neutral and their eventual net zero journey. And then an overview of typically what a carbon neutral journey might look like. So the webinar should last for 45 minutes. There's a Q&A at the end, and as James said, put your questions in the Q&A box as we go through the thing, and we'll pick them up at the end. And then we'll be recording the webinar, and it's available on the FSB website.
John, sorry to interrupt. I don't think you're sharing your screen.
I should be. Sorry about that. Technical. Finger problem from one of the operators. Yeah. So let me go through that again. So the agenda today is to demystify the carbon jargon, why SMEs are vital to the UK carbon neutral and net zero journey, an overview of what a typical net journey would look like, a net zero journey would look like, or carbon neutral journey would look like, and then 45-minute webinar, Q&As at the end, Please put your questions in the Q&A box as we go through, and there will be a recording of it available on the FSB website. Okay, so let's start. So it's all very confusing. It is. The language in itself is confusing, and one of the things I found when I was doing some research for this this webinar was I found an interesting stuff on British Chambers, and basically what it said is that 1 in 5 business, 22%, don't fully understand the term net zero. What actually surprised me there wasn't the fact that 1 in 5 didn't understand it. It actually surprised me that, you know, quite a large percentage actually did understand it, because there is a lot of confusion about what it actually means. Yeah, even on the web, you put into Google net zero, and you'll probably get 10 or 20 different definitions of what that means. So what I'll try and do here is to clarify that, plus other expressions and terms used within the carbon industry. So first of all, let's look at what do GHG emissions mean. So you may have heard of GHG emissions. Typically it's CO2, but it doesn't only include CO2, it includes 7 main gases. Yeah, and these were defined quite a long time ago, yeah, by the Kyoto Protocol as to what those 7 gases are. So obviously the main one is CO2, but then you've got methane, excuse me a moment. You've got methane, and that's used in electricity generation, fertilizer production, antifreeze, etc. And then you've got nitrous oxides, also called laughing gas. That's mostly pharmacological use. And then you've got the F gases, HFCs and PFCs, and they're used in refrigeration, semiconductor, electronic production, and fire extinguishing, automatic fire extinguishing, and aerosols, so your deodorants, etc. The next one you've got is SF6, hexafluoride, sulfur hexafluoride. That's almost exclusively, primarily used in switchgear. And then you've got NF3, and that's electronics production. So what you can see underneath each of these has got a times number. So if you look under the NF3 one, it's 16,100. What that means is, if you released a ton of NF3, please don't, it would be equivalent to 16,100 tons of CO2. So that's a massive, and all of the ones under that. So you can see, for example, SF6, sulfur hexafluoride, is 23,500. Yeah, so 1 ton of that is equal to 23,500 tons, yeah, of CO2. So it's a massive, massive thing. Luckily, there aren't much of those gases released, and the main one is CO2. So what they've done was, rather than try to, they couldn't have 7 gases out there. It's too complicated to understand. So what they do is they convert it all back into what's called a TCO2e, which is a ton of CO2 equivalent. Yeah. So when somebody produces a carbon report, yeah, a carbon footprint, what they do is they look at your bills, yeah, and then they get from the government's website, or they probably have them on a computer, they get something that, like an equivalence, a spreadsheet, which shows how much, yeah, 1 kilowatt of energy actually generates in TCO2, and it takes into account all of those other gases as well. So all that work is done for people like myself when we do a carbon footprint. Yeah, so that's basically what GHG emissions means. It's not just CO2, it's a combination of one, which is then referred back to and amalgamated with other gases to give you a TCO2e, ton of CO2 equivalent. Yeah. So next slide. One of the things that you'll hear about in the carbon stuff is, what are the scopes? Yeah, what are the scopes? There's 3 scopes. There's scope 1, which is direct. Scope 2 is indirect, and scope 3 are indirect too. What do they actually mean? Okay, so scope 1, typically scope 1 would be gas boilers. So it's the stuff that you burn. So it'd be gas boilers and company vehicles that are owned and operated by the company. Yeah, so they're relatively simple to classify. They're within your control. Yeah, you'd look at your gas bills, you look at your how much miles you've done, what gas what diesel you use, what fuel you've used, and you can calculate relatively simply your scope 1. Yeah, scope 2, kind of similar, although it's indirect. It's the gases that are burnt that you use, so they're burnt elsewhere. So typically for most companies, yeah, that would be electricity. So you know, you get your electricity bill. You look at the electricity bill, you say how many kilowatts it is. Somebody comes in, you then run a calculation on that to see how many TCO2 that is. The challenging one is scope 3. That's where the big challenge is. Yeah, if you look there, the scope 3 ones, yeah, are these ones here and here. And you can see that includes everything else you do as a business. Yeah. And they're split into two activity streams. One is upstream and one is downstream. Upstream stuff is the products and the stuff that you buy to create what you sell. So if you're a widget manufacturer and you buy 10 components to create your widget, yeah, it's basically those components that you bought to create your widget. That's included in that upstream stuff. That also includes transportation. So, you know, those components have got to be transported to you. It's included in here. They might be packaged, so that's waste operations. It includes business travel. So if you're traveling to meet your supplier of the components for your widgets, it would be them. It's employee commuting. So if your employees are commuting in the office, that's part of your upstream scope 3 activities. And then you've got downstream. So that's effectively when you've sold it. Yeah, so you've created your widget, you're now going to send it out. So transportation and distribution could be, you know, sending it to the supermarket that sells it, or the store that sells it. Yeah, the processing of sold goods, use of sold products, and end of life treatment, all of that. So all of the stuff on the sold side is your downstream activities. And you can see, I think just by looking at that, you can make a reasonable guess that that's going to be far, far bigger, yeah, than your scope 1 and scope 2. Yeah, the real challenge is in scope 3, and I've tried to sort of demonstrate that here, yeah, by using an analogy of an iceberg. Yeah, so typically in an iceberg, you know, 85 to 95% of it is below the water, and that's the same for scope 3. Yeah, so scope 3 will typically form between 85 and 95% of a company's emissions. But for some companies, it's even more. Yeah. So Microsoft released their latest carbon report. I think it was February this year, February, March, which I had a look through. And interestingly, their scope 3 emissions were 50 times the combined scope 1 and 2. So you can see it's a massive, massive part of their footprint. And if you think back to the last slide and where those emissions come from, that's all outside their control. That's their supply chain emissions. Yeah. So getting those emissions when it's so big is a real challenge. And I've got a slide later on where I go into that in a bit more detail. Yeah, about what the challenge is for Microsoft, because it's an interesting study. But that's basically what the scopes are. So you can see from this that scope 3, yeah, is the real challenge. Yeah, that's the one that most businesses have to cope on. Now, so here's a key question: the difference between, carbon neutral and net zero. So carbon neutral, you can get to carbon neutral. The key thing is you can get to carbon neutral by offsetting. Offsetting is buying carbon credits. So that's buying into a project that's doing something to reduce carbon. Yeah, either either a direct reduction, or it could be solar panels, it could be putting peak down, it could be trees, whatever. So it's buying credits, yeah, to offset that amount. So if you're a business, if you're the people that manufacture the widgets and you've got 10 tons of carbon left after you've done your first round of mitigation and reduction, and these 10 tons you can't get rid of in the short term, but you'd like to get to carbon neutral, what you would do is you'd buy 10 tons of approved offsets, yeah, and that would then give you carbon neutrality. And then your plan would be, the next year I'm going to reduce by another 2 tons, yeah, so next year I only have to buy 8. So you can get there by buying these offsets, yeah. Net zero, yeah, is completely different. You can't get there by buying offsets, yeah. You can only get there by carbon reduction and carbon removal and capture. Yeah, that's how you get to net zero. Yeah, there's lots of definitions out there about net zero. There's no single definition that says this is the correct one, but this is generally accepted as the definition of net zero. Yeah, and you know, if you look at the first two here, carbon neutral, you can get to, I mean, you can get to that within 12 months. Realistically, you can by buying offsets. Yeah, net zero carbon, depending on the business, it could be anywhere from 5 years to 15, 20, 30 years. It really could, because, you know, if you think about that scope 3 and you're a complex manufacturing business, that's really, really quite challenging. Yeah. So carbon neutral, 12 months, net zero, depending on the business, at the least 5 years, I would say. At the most, could be 30 years, could be 40 years. And then the third one that you won't hear so much about is zero carbon. Yeah. That is not possible at the moment. The technology isn't there. It means you have a business that doesn't emit any CO2e, which is basically just impossible. Yeah, so that's what carbon neutral and net zero mean. Yeah, and as I say, there's lots of definitions. This is an accepted definition, but there are lots out there. So you might have heard about an expression or a word that's been circulating a lot recently on the media, yeah, called greenwashing. Yeah, so what is greenwashing? Well, greenwashing is essentially when a company puts out a marketing release, yeah, saying that they're environmentally correct for certain things. So it could be a product, it could be whatever, yeah, but there's no real data and proof behind that. So a couple of examples here, yeah, are in 2020, Ryanair had just put an announcement out, said it was the lowest emissions airline in Europe. Yeah, there was no data behind it. There was nothing there behind anything that justified it or backed it up. So the ASA, Advertising Standards Agency, promptly said, please take the ad down. So they had to take it down. H&M and fast fashion. Fast fashion is well known as having a very, very large environmental impact. Yeah, and there's a lot of greenwashing goes on there. The worst one is actually H&M. Apparently, they're the worst offended with a shocking 96% of their claims not holding up. Yeah, this is an interesting one. This is the ASA. They received some complaints for an ad that Corn had done, and that ad basically said that their Taiwan degree in pot helps us reduce our carbon footprint. Yeah, the ASA upheld the complaints and asked them to take down the advert. But what was interesting was that Corn said that they had got from Carbon Trust a carbon footprint reduction certificate to state that. So it just goes to show you have to be careful. Even when you think you've done right, you have to be careful that the claims that you're making are backed up, by certifiable or verifiable claims. Yeah, that's the key thing. They've got to be verifiable. Yeah, and obviously in this instance, the ASA felt that they weren't verifiable, and that's why they asked them to take the ad down. So SMEs in the UK's net zero journey. Yeah, so really, why me? I could understand why a lot of SMEs might feel that. I'm a small 10-person company or even smaller, yeah, or even a bigger company, 20, 30 people. And you're asking me to get to net zero. Why don't you go talk to the guy down the road, the corporate who's got 2,000 people, lots of funding and resource to enable him to do it, yeah? Why me? And the reason is quite simple. We literally can't do it without you. And I'm a big believer in not misusing the word literally, but in this instance, it's true. We literally cannot get to net zero, yeah, without the SMEs being encouraged to come along and being sponsored to come along. It's impossible. And the reason for that, I'll explain in the next slide. So let's look at some facts and figures and quotes. The carbon footprint is a mystery to 9 out of 10 small businesses. This again is taken from a British Chambers survey that they've done in partnership with somebody. I can't remember who it was with. Yeah, but when I read that, my first impression of that was, well, that's quite scary. But then I thought about it and I thought, well, hang on a second. We've had 2 years of pandemic. Yeah, we've now into the fastest rising inflation, yes, since probably the 70s. Most people on this call probably don't remember that level of inflation. Sadly, I do. Yeah, and it's not only rising; it's the way it's rising. It's doubled. Yeah. In basically the past 6 months since the beginning of the year. At the beginning of the year, it was 5 point something, and now it's over 9, and it's expected to go up to 11 this year. Hopefully, it's not going to hit the sort of levels we saw back in the 70s of 30%. Hopefully, we can keep that genie in the bottle. But that's what that's what I thought. I thought so. Businesses, particularly SMEs, who've had a really tough time over the past 2 years, their focus at the moment isn't on my carbon footprint. Yeah, it's on how do I get my business through. I've managed to survive 2 years. This, how do I get my business through my costs exploding out of control? Yeah, so that's going to be their key focus. Yeah, so I can understand why it's a bit of a mystery to 9 out of 10 small businesses. But here's something that's interesting. Smaller businesses responsible for nearly 50% of all greenhouse gas emissions emitted by all UK business. Yeah, so that, and what's interesting about that is that it lines up with the SME businesses input into GDP. Yeah, so of 100% of business GDP into the UK, SMEs account for 52% of it. So it's aligned with M2, which I thought was quite interesting. Yeah, so that's why, you know, we must get the SMEs along with us. It's tough for them, but we got to make it feasible and possible for them to get involved in it. And the government knows this. They know that they can't do it without the SME sector. Yeah, small businesses need to be front and center in a national effort to reduce emissions. Yeah, the problem is, how do you do it? How do you make them that? Yeah, and you know, some of the stuff from the survey, again, it's from the British Chambers one. Yeah, almost 2/3 of businesses they don't see net target as a high priority. Yeah. Now, in the wake of the pandemic, again, to go back to the first point, I can understand that. Yeah, it's about surviving, getting through this, having passed through the pandemic. Yeah, now surviving. Hopefully, the next 12 months until we can come out the end of what's probably going to turn into a recession. Yeah, hopefully, and then get through that. But I think what happens is that if you're not on the side of the opportunity of being carbon neutral, yeah, you'll be on the risk side of it. Yeah, because what's happening, and I'll come to it later, is more and more it's being forced down onto small businesses. So if they don't embrace it and get on board with it, you know, it's going to be really tough. That's part of the challenge, because the big businesses are putting it down, and not surprisingly, yeah, it all comes down to finance. Yeah, I mean, they talk about grants, they talk about tax allowances, but the message there and that quote, yeah, is we don't have the finances to do this. You know, we've struggled through a pandemic. Yeah, we've now got, as I say, rising costs, spiking costs, and you know, there's only so much you can cope with. So that's the why me. But you understand it. We all understand it's difficult. Yeah, but you know, we have to get SME engagement. So, despite all of those challenges, what we are seeing, there's quite a lot of businesses across all sectors, large and small, that are engaging in the carbon neutrality programs. Yeah, and why are they doing that? Now, I go to a lot. Excuse me. I do a lot of networking. Yeah, and a common theme that I hear when I'm networking is how difficult it is to get staff. Yeah. Get them, retain them, etc., etc. Yeah, so I thought it was an interesting thing to look at. So I went online and I found some research that Total Jobs had done. I'm sure most people on this call have heard of Total Jobs. Yeah, and what was interesting is 26% of British workers would be willing to take a pay cut in exchange for working with a business that they felt was more green. Yeah, which was really interesting. What was more interesting was that of the 72, I think it was 72% of that 26%, yeah, were in the age bracket 35 to, I think, 25 to 40. So the younger people are the ones that are even more engaged. And in actual fact, even the older ones at 60 plus, yeah, it was something like, it was over 60% of them felt the same way. So there is a real drive for it. Now, the key question is, this was done before the current problems and cost of living squeeze. Would that still be the same now? I don't know. You'd have to do another survey, but that kind of gives a view of what the British working people think and how they're engaged with the whole environmental campaign. The other thing is marketing opportunity. Differentiate yourself in the market. I mentioned over there that 64% don't know. Be one of the 36%, yeah, and it could pay dividends. It could actually boost your sales, increasing your top line and your bottom line, yeah. But when you do it, be very careful about greenwashing, because if you do it, you want to shout about it, yeah. And if you shout about it, you'll be noticed. And if you haven't done it properly, yeah, and that could be through anything that's just lack of expertise, as mentioned on the right, and not understanding. Yeah, so go to the right person, the right company, and get the right information about what you need to do to make sure you don't get accused of greenwashing. Consumer and client demand. So I mentioned Microsoft earlier, yeah, and this was interesting because in that same report, Microsoft basically said they now require all of their suppliers to report their emissions. And the reason for that is because they're now digging into their scope 3, that's all in their supply chain. Yeah. And it didn't specifically say it, but the reading behind the scenes, it was definitely, the message was either do it or you're not going to be working with Microsoft for very long. Yeah. They apparently have data from 87% of their suppliers, so most of their suppliers are getting on board. Now, if you're a B2C business, yeah, interesting stat here was that 52% of consumers will be swayed by sustainability issues. So if you've got two companies, you've got company A and B, and company B is verifiably greener than company A, they'll buy from company B. And again, there was an interesting statistic here. I didn't put it in because I wasn't so certain about it. Its credibility now was they said that they asked the question, would you pay a premium? And people said, yes, they would. They would pay a premium of, you know, up to sort of 7.5 to 10%, yeah, to buy from that more green company. Whether that's still the case now with the cost of living squeeze, I don't know, but it certainly was back in 2021 when the survey was done I took this from. Legal reporting. Yeah, so this currently primarily applies directly to large enterprises. Yeah, but there's two things you've got to think about here. The expectation is that over the next few years, the ceiling for this will reduce. Yeah, so at the moment, I can't remember the numbers, but say it's 10 million at the moment. Yeah, and this is about things like ESOS and stuff like that, SECR. Yeah, so it will reduce down. Yeah, and then more and more companies will be captured. But what's also happening is these larger enterprises, and this comes back to the whole client demand thing above, yeah, is they're being forced, yeah, to push this down their supply chain because they're now having to dig into their scope 3, yeah, and that means going to their supply chain, and not only their direct supply chain, their indirect one. So, you know, it could be somebody that's supplying to a supplier, yeah, and basically that's forcing itself down through that chain where they're saying, I need your information because my shareholders, my stockholders, my analysts, you know, my stakeholders, everybody's asking me, yeah, what is my carbon footprint? You know, the whole ESG things involved. So all of that is starting to sort of force itself down through it, yeah. And that basically, these are all have a similar theme. This is tender returns as well. So, and you know, back in September last year, the government issued PPN 0621. And what that says is that if you are bidding for central government contract of £5 million or greater, you must have a clear reduction plan on how you will get not to carbon neutral, but to net zero. So that's a huge amount of work, yeah. And this applies to framework contracts. So if you're a supplier to somebody who's bidding for that, and although your part of the work may be only, I don't know, 250,000, you're captured up with that because that supplier will be saying to you, if you want to be my subcontractor on this or a supplier, you have to provide me with the carbon footprint, yeah, and you have to provide me with your plan to net zero, yeah. And since April and May, the NHS have adopted the same measure. So if you want to work directly with the NHS, you have to basically follow the same procedure now. So you know, so all of that together, that's the, you know, client demand, legal reporting, the tender returns. It's all forcing it down, yeah, into the sort of SME side of the market. This, I think everybody knows about it. We've already talked about this. Increasing costs, yeah. As I mentioned earlier, inflation, I think it's sitting at 9.2 or 9.4%. Well, you never know, it seems to be increasing every day. It's expected to 11% in the end of the year. It's the rate of increase is incredible, though. I mean, it's nearly doubled since January. I mean, I never thought I would see that again, to be honest. Yeah. So that's the market forces that are driving it. Yeah. On the other side of this, you've got the challenges. Yeah. And I think the major challenge is lack of expertise and data. And it's just seen as too big a challenge. It's an elephant. Where do I start? It's huge, yeah. And also as well, because time is always a challenge, yeah, in any business, but particularly at the moment in smaller business, because they've got so much stuff demanding their time, yeah, it's the time to correct that lack of knowledge and understanding. That's the challenge. They don't have the time to do it, yeah. There's also a level of confusion. You know, confusion can equal paralysis. Yeah, so the view becomes it's better I do nothing, yeah, rather than do something with the best of intentions and then get beat up for it because I didn't do it right, yeah. And the thing is here, you know, the greenwashing stuff, you don't need proof. The court of public opinion can be very damaging as well. And then there's the perceived costs. We mentioned over the page, you talked about grants and stuff like that. This is all about how much it's going to cost. So our view is carbon neutral does not need to cost the earth. Yeah. So that's the market forces and challenges, an overview of them. So your carbon journey. We use a BSI standard, a British Standards Institute. We use PAS 2060. That's what we use to do your roadmap to carbon neutrality. So why did we do it? Last year, Auditel started looking at adding carbon auditing, for want of a better expression, into their offerings that they talk to customers about. So they looked at various things. There's lots of things out there where companies have created their own little badges, their own little certificates, etc., etc. Yeah, we didn't want to go down that route because we wanted something that was a properly recognised standard. And BSI PAS 2060 is the only internationally recognised carbon neutrality standard. There's lots of certificates out there. Yeah, those are not internationally recognised neutrality standards. And there's one point in here which kind of I'll explain the difference. But there was other reasons why the PAS 2060 we saw as a great standard to use or and build upon. One is that it sets out a very clear standard for carbon neutrality claims. It's a simple, clear process. The internals of it are complicated, particularly when you get to scope 3. Yeah, but the actual process is quite clear. And what we like about it is it's flexible and it's what I call sensible. And I'll explain what I mean by that in the coming points. Yeah. It requires you to go beyond scope 1 and 2. So you can't get carbon neutrality according to PAS 2060 by just doing scope 1 and 2 emissions. So a lot of places will come in, they'll do scope 1 and 2 emissions, yeah, and they'll say, here you go, that's it. So they've looked at the surface, they've looked at the sort of the 5 to 10% of the iceberg, yeah, and they've not looked at all the stuff that's below the water, the scope 3 emissions, yeah. You can't do that with PAS 2060. You have to go into scope 3 emissions, yeah, and I'll come to later which ones you actually have to go into. And you cannot meet it by carbon offset purchase alone. So what that means is, going back to your widget manufacturer, he might be 10 tons in year 1. So he can buy 10 tons of offsets in year 1, that's fine. But he has to have a plan in place with definitive actions on how he's going to achieve a carbon reduction over the next 12 months. So it might only be 2 tons, yeah, because it allows a flexible, sensible approach to it, yeah. But you have to, so next year he's got to hit those 2-ton targets, yeah, and he can't buy 10 tons. So you can't just rinse and repeat 10 tons every year. You have to show carbon reduction in emissions, yeah. So that's a key thing as well, because a lot of these places they don't insist on that. These sort of self-done certifications. PAS 2060 insists on it. This is a key one in my view. It's independently verifiable by a UCAS certified organization. If anybody doesn't understand what a UCAS organization or isn't familiar with the term, it's UK Accreditation Services. So it's the Veritas, it's the company down on the left-hand side of the thing, NQA, it's BSI themselves. So they're certified by UCAS to go into organizations, yeah, and verify and certify them to certain standards, yeah. So ISO, people might be familiar with 9001, 27001, 14001. So they're the organizations that come in and certify you or that you've met that standard. So they all can also do the same thing with PAS 2060. They can come in and they can verify you that you've met the PAS 2060 standards. And that's really important because it's an independent one. You're not marking your own homework here or, whatever. You're getting somebody that's completely independent to come in and verify you've done it correctly. So the outputs. PAS 2060 is about outputs. They can be applied to multiple frameworks. And frameworks, by frameworks, I mean ISO 14001. Which is the EMS standard, SBTI, which science-based technology information, science-based targets standard. It's a framework, yeah. So the way it works with ISO and these ones is it takes the data that PAS 2060 produces. So that's all the emission data and everything, and it feeds it into the relevant sections within those ISO standards, in this instance 14,001. So there's a particular section in 14,001 that says what is your environmental impact. So PAS 2060 informs into that, gives you all the information about your carbon footprint, etc., what you're going to do to reduce it. All of that information feeds into 14,001. So 14,001 is not a replacement for PAS 2060. It's PAS 2060 is an enhancement and an informer into 14,001 and SBTI. What I like about it as well, and what we all like about it in Auditel, is it's entity-based. So what that means, so you're the widget manufacturer, you have 3 offices, yeah, you've got your head office and two smaller sites in the UK. You might decide at the start, I don't want to bite off more than I can chew here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get carbon neutrality on my head office. So PAS 26, you're allowed to do that. What you do is you basically put a boundary in, you define an entity, and you say the only thing that this is going to apply to is that. So the whole organization isn't done, but you've started off in a structured manner. You've started off without trying to do too much at once. You're just looking at one particular area, and depending how complex your business is, that might be a very, very good approach to take. Yeah. So if you've got a really complicated business, like manufacturing or something like that, yeah, that's complicated, it might be a good idea to take that slowly approach rather than try to do all at once. Yeah, because it can be quite overwhelming. So that's the why did we go down the route of using PAS 2060. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I forgot the last one. And the most important thing is if you're PAS 2060 certified or verified, you have a lot of protection against accusations of greenwashing. If you've done all the PAS 2060 process, and particularly if you've been independently verified by a UCAS certified organization, yeah, you're at a gold standard there, and any type of greenwashing accusations, yeah, are not really relevant. That's the key thing. So this is the process for PAS 2060. So the first thing you do is you define and measure. So step 1 is you define and measure. And that's really about defining a baseline, where you are, what's your current position, yeah, and it allows you to take stock of what you need to do. So this then provides most of the information that you would need to create your carbon reduction plan, and then to understand what your priorities are in the short, medium, and long term. Yeah, that's the start point of it. Yeah, and it's like anything, you need to understand what a baseline you have, and from there you can then plan and decide what you want to do in the future. So step 2 is reduce. Yeah, so what you can do now is you can create a detailed carbon reduction plan. Yeah, so you've got the key information, you've got the boundaries, you've got the entities. So in the instance of the widget manufacturer have decided it's only the home office. Yeah, so what you can now decide on, what is the overall approach that you want to make? So for example, you might decide, well, I don't want to go for carbon neutral at this point. What I want to do is I want to take any funding that I have available, yeah, and I want to put it into carbon reduction strategies. My apologies about that. Didn't switch my phone off. Hope everybody else has got theirs off. Yeah. So you might want to put it into carbon reduction strategy. So you might want to do, I don't know, you might want to do an LED lighting project. Yeah. You might want to look at a solar array for your building. Yeah. And then what you want to do is then look at prioritizing where you want to focus your efforts on. So it might well be that you don't focus them on something big because it's too complicated. You might want to focus them on something smaller and work on them first, because you've got some low-hanging fruit, some easy stuff to achieve to give you some momentum in your whole carbon reduction plan. And then you can look at, you then implement it and you measure over the first period. Yeah. Step 3 is offsetting. So in step 2, if you've decided that you do want to go for carbon neutrality at this time, yeah, this is where you make a decision on what offsets you want to use. Now, the offsets that you want to use are entirely up to you. Auditel don't do offsets, but we will provide guidance on which ones meet the PAS 2060 requirements. Yeah, PAS 2060 only does high quality offsets. Yeah, and you can also make a decision on validation at this point. Yeah. Like most standards, it allows you to self-validate. There's various types of validation you can do, and I'll come to that a bit later, but maybe you want to make a decision at this point on what validation it is you want to do. Step 4 is where you document. So you take the carbon footprint report, which you produced in step 1, you take your carbon reduction plan, which you produced in step 2, you take the documentation that you've produced in step 3, you combine all those, yeah, and you create what's called a qualifying explanatory statement, a QES, and that's a key document for PAS. Without PAS, you can't, without that, you can't be PAS certified, yeah, and that document combines all of those, yeah. It takes some other information and artifacts, it puts them in, it takes some declarations of commitment, and it's a public facing document. You have to put it on your website, yeah, so that the public can go in and see, okay, this is what you've done, this is how you've done it, I understand how you've got to carbon neutrality. That's the principle behind it, yeah. So you can put it up there on your website, and you can then use that as a marketing tool to say, I've now done it to PAS 2060, it's verified. If you've gone down the verification route, yeah, instead of validation, yeah, and you can be proud of the fact that you've done that. So, and we don't, Auditel, we don't run it as a project, we run it more as a service. So we'll provide you support all the way through that process. And that process might last, it might last 12 months, it may last a bit less. To complete all that documentation might take some time, but we're with you the whole way on that one. So, carbon footprint reports. First of all carbon footprint reports are not equal. What we tried to do is to give people some guidance, is to look at what are the different types of carbon footprint reports you can get. So we broke it into 9 levels. So level 1 to 5. Now, these are they're not all, but largely these are online calculators. Yeah. And I've said unlikely to be verified by UCAS certified organization. The reason I've used unlikely is I haven't spoken to every UCAS certified organization in the country, but certainly the ones that I've spoken to have said, unless it's PAS 60, unless it follows the PAS 60 process and it has all of the PAS 60 artifacts, yeah, so that's the QES, etc., they will not touch it and look at it for independent verification. And most of these will not have that. Yeah, I don't know if all of them won't have it. Yeah, but certainly the level of audit that's required to get to PAS 60 is not really practical and possible within levels 1 to 5, because when you do the verification, it's not a tick in the box. There's a lot of deep investigation into the data. You know, whether you've done the data analysis correctly. There's a lot of investigation done by the verifiers. So level 6 to 9, yeah, that's where we operate. We operate in level 6 to 9. What you have to be careful about, yeah, for levels 1 to 5 is this is where you'll get accusations of greenwashing, because there's nothing behind it. Yeah, there's no verification behind it to say this is correct. Yeah. So level 6 to 9, this is where Auditel works. Auditel operates in those particular areas, and that's where PAS 2066 sits. Yeah. So starting off at level 6, and as I mentioned earlier, you have to start digging into scope 3 for PAS 2060. Yeah. So material scope 3. Material means if it's a substantial amount of contribution to your emissions, it must be included. Yeah. And the categories that you must include is 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9. These have to be included in your carbon report. Now, if one of those is impossible to get, for example, yeah, you can put in a you can put in a justification to exclude it in the particular one that you're doing at the moment. Yeah, as long as you've got a plan in, how are you going to get it in the future? So if one of those is a supplier in China, which you cannot get the information out of, you can put something in there that says it's excluded, yeah, with a plan on how you're going to get it in the future. So there has to be a plan there behind how you're going to achieve this in the future, but it does allow you the flexibility to do that. So 7 is the same as 6, but only it's third-party verification, and then you just move up in the level and depth that you're going into. So level 8, yeah, is a really tough one. That's all of scope 3. So if you think back to scope 3 and you think about doing all of that, that's a massive challenge. Yeah, and it also includes the life cycle emissions on products. So the widget manufacturer, he would have to do all of that on all his products, so the whole life cycle emissions. So that's basically from start to finish. He'd have to do all of that. Massive challenge. And then level 9 is the same thing, yeah, but with third-party verification. So it's a massive, massive challenge. 8 and 9 are really challenging. Yeah, 6 and 7 are challenging, and that's where we operate across all of them, but that's where we see at the moment most of the stuff coming from is 6 and 7. Yeah, 8 and 9 we're starting to see demand for it, but that's a big, big challenge at the moment. And what people are doing is they're doing a product specific one, yeah, as an opposed to the whole thing. That's what we're starting to see. So, and the step 2 of this is reduce. Yeah, so the reduce thing is, and I mentioned it earlier, it's a sensible step. So first of all, you identify what it is you want to do. So in the instance that I gave, it would be the head office. There's a lot more information about the identifying within it, but effectively it would be identifying the head office and any specific subjects, etc., within the head office, and then carbon sources, etc., emission sources within there. So there's a lot of information around there, yeah, but effectively you're identifying what it is, your carbon footprint, and what's going to be included. You then prioritize. You prioritize, okay, so how am I going to reduce the particular emissions sources that I've got? So for example, it could be your electricity bill. You could say, right, okay, I've got a big warehouse, I've got all this old-fashioned lighting in there, I'm going to put LED lighting in, yeah, because that will save me. That's a high on my priority list. That's what I'm going to do. The next thing you do is you implement it, yeah, and then you measure it. And each year you do the same thing. Yeah, so each year you go through, identify, prioritize, implement, measure. Now, identify and prioritize, yeah, in year 2 onwards, unless the business changes, would pretty much be the same. Yeah, so a lot of it is about, in year 2 onwards, unless the business changes, is about implementing and measuring. Yeah, so it's about making sure that you implement the plans you've got for the next year, and then you measure it. So this is a quick look at high quality carbon offsets. So these are the ones that the PAS 2060 insists on, and this is a look at a certificate here. I've blanked out so to take the customer information, but this is one actually customer brought. Yeah, so basically it says a discrete reduction in GHG emissions not arising from the defined subject. What it means is you've not reduced them, you've bought something that allows you to write them off effectively and become carbon neutral. Yeah, so to balance that out, that's what you've done. Yeah, and the important thing is they've got to be high quality voluntary offset credits. Yeah, verified. Yeah, that's what PAS 2060. There's lots and lots of different ones out there. There's voluntary offsets, the one underneath, unregulated and generally unverified. Yeah, I mean, you can buy them for cents, yeah, or you pay a little bit more and you buy some good quality ones. So document and validate. I showed you the documents here. The key documents, the carbon footprint report, the carbon reduction plan, they are combined together and they, with other artifacts and other content, into the qualifying explanatory statement. Yeah, and that's basically, that's your key document. That's the thing that holds what you've done, yeah, to meet the PAS 2060 requirements. So the different types of validation. I mentioned earlier there are different types of validation available, as there are for most standards. Yeah, so the 3 types are self-validation, other party validation, and independent third party verification. Slight difference there. So if I use an exam as an analogy, yeah, the sort of self-validation is kind of like student marking themselves. Yeah, they think they've done a great job, so they're going to mark it themselves and give themselves an A. Yeah, other party validation. So we wouldn't do that. We don't come in. We do the carbon footprinting, we do the carbon planning, but we won't then validate it because we wouldn't mark our own homework. Yeah, and overall, I see this as like kind of being marked by the tutor. Yeah, which is better than marking it yourself, but not as good as the third one, which is the exam board have done the marking. So that's an NQA or a BSI, or somebody has come into your organization. Yeah, they've looked at the work that you've done. They've looked at the QES. They've looked at the carbon footprint report. They've looked at all the stuff that you've done. They've looked at the data. They've dug into it. They've checked that the data is correct. Yeah, they do a lot of investigation. It takes 2 or 3 days to do it. Yeah, and then they went, yeah, we're satisfied with that, and you get a certificate from them saying, yeah, we're verifying that your carbon neutrality claims are valid. That's what you get. So The last slide is about. I mentioned at the start that one of our things is it doesn't have to cost the earth. Carbon neutrality does not need to cost the earth, and the way we look towards achieving that is using our historical strength. Our historical strength is in procurement and cost analysis and reduction. Yeah. So what we try to do is we tie together that strength into something that I call smart procurement. So this is a quick look at step one of smart procurement. So we're on a cost reduction program, and we've been doing that for many years. I mean, Auditel was started in 1995, and they've been doing cost reduction and procurement since then. So we have a well-established program of what we do to achieve that. It's 6 steps basically. Yeah, and if you look at step number 1, understand and assess current position, that's very much like step 1 of the carbon program, which is define and measure. So it's kind of the same thing, yeah, just slightly called something different. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to find a baseline, yeah, for where we are, and what we're looking at is we're looking at the same data as well. Yeah, we're looking at we're looking at your electricity bills. We're looking at where is your high spend. Yeah, in both instances, because certainly for the initial part of the carbon program, where we identify initially, and there's a lot more to it in the carbon program, but where we would look initially as where are you spending a lot of money? Because if you're spending £100,000 a year on something, the chances are, and this is obviously it's not 100%, but the chances are you're creating a lot of carbon emissions from that. Yeah, so if your electricity bill is £100,000 a year, you're creating a lot of emissions from it. Yeah. Whereas if if you're spending £5 a year on it, you're probably not. It's probably not a lot of emissions. And the same thing applies to cost reduction. If you're spending £100,000 a year on it, it's worthwhile together looking at how can we reduce it. You're spending £5 a year. It's not worth anybody's effort. So it's kind of the same thing we're looking at, and that's where we use our cost reduction program and expertise and tie it into the carbon program to try and make it self-funding. So any savings that we get out of this initial part of smart procurement, yeah, we feed that into the carbon program to support the carbon program. That's the whole point of it. Yeah. The next thing we can look at is your supply chain. So not only in terms of cost, but in terms of sustainable suppliers. So it could be that we can get better, more sustainable suppliers, which then gives you a carbon reduction, which feeds through into your carbon program, which reduces the offsets potentially you have to buy. So the whole reduction thing feeds through. So being carbon neutral can actually be quite a good boost, yeah, to your bottom line, because all of that's feeding through and reducing and increasing your profitability by reducing your costs. Yeah, that's the key thing. And I think that's where we're quite unique, because we have those dual skill sets. So that's level 2 of what I call smart procurement. Yeah. So level 3 is where we bring in capital projects. Yeah. So this is one that we done, an LED project for a company that had quite a big warehouse. They replaced some old lighting they had there, probably strip lighting. They replaced it with LED lighting. The capital cost of that program was £53,000. So it wasn't a huge program, but it was quite a large program. Yeah, their ROI was 2 years. Yeah, and they had a carbon reduction of 48 tons, massive carbon reduction. So we take that, and all of that feeds through. It feeds through into cost reduction. It feeds through into the carbon program. So if you think about it, if we put that in, it reduces your cost, yeah, because all of a sudden your electricity bills have come down, which means it's reduced your carbon reduction, which feeds through the carbon reduction program into your carbon program, which means you have to get rid of less, you have to buy less offsets. Yeah, so all of that sort of feeding all the way through, and it shares itself very well across the different things. So that's what we mean when we say, Auditel smart procurement. Carbon neutrality doesn't need to cost the earth. Yeah, if you do it cleverly, yeah, it can become a real boost to your business. Thank you very much, everybody. My apologies that my phone went off. But yeah, so that's my contact details. Thanks very much for listening in. We got the Q&A now. Hopefully we've got some good questions there. I'll pass it across back over to James.
Great, thank you so much, John. That was really helpful. Just really good practical advice in terms of simple steps that people can follow. But also, I'm really glad you kept the sort of science bit in just because I think it's important to understand what we're up against and what we're working to, rather than just seeing these sort of buzzwords or phrases. It's important to know the sort of detail behind it.
Yeah.
We've got a few questions that have come in, so I'll dive straight into those for the last 5 minutes that we've got. Chris, if perhaps I could bring you in for this first question. It's from Simon, and it is, in an integrated supply chain, what is the cutoff point between one company's upstream Scope 3 emissions and another's downstream Scope 3 emissions, and how is this determined to avoid overlap double counting?
Yeah, great question. And no surprise that the first question is relating to Scope 3, given how tricky it is and how much uncertainty there is around that. That was actually one of my first questions when I started working with John. And the simple answer is there is an element of double counting. It's obviously judged on a case-by-case basis, but what fits into one company's Scope 1 will inevitably also fit into a Scope 3 as well. So there is an element of double counting. It's a hard question to answer in a generic fashion, but it isn't simply a case of you just cut one off and start the other one. There is an element of double counting there. As baffling as that sounds, that is, unless I'm mistaken, they're wrong, John. I think that's pretty much how it works.
Yeah, that is the challenge around it. Although recently we have done one where a courier company was certified as carbon neutral, and they'd gone through a correct process, and we accepted the fact that they were carbon neutral, yeah, and reduced our customers, one that we were doing the carbon footprint for, we included it in the figures, but reduced out their carbon emissions, yeah, because they had a verifiable carbon. So the courier was verifiably carbon neutral. So therefore, that part of their Scope 3, the customer was removed because the company that was their transport company was a verifiably carbon neutral company. So it can happen, yeah. But like Chris says, in some instances it is double counting, and you can't really do it. It's done on a case-by-case basis, definitely, as Chris says.
Great. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you. Thanks so much, and thanks for the question, Simon. Next question, John. Perhaps I'll direct this to you. You touched on some of this in the last slide, but this is from Charlotte. It says, as a startup, what are the costs? I'm wanting to work to be as eco as possible, but of course, as cost effective as possible. Yeah. I guess just if you've got any examples around sort of percentages of costs, that kind of thing, that might be helpful.
It's a really tough question to go into costs, and the reason for it is each business is individual and different. It depends what they've already done. Yeah. What I would suggest is if you got my contact details there. If was it Charlotte? Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Charlotte, give me a call, drop me a line, connect on LinkedIn. Yeah. Lots of different methods there. And we can have a chat about it, and I can understand what your business looks like. And then I can give you an idea of what that would look like. Yeah. I understand why you want to. Why it's just really, I don't want to say X because I don't know what the business looks like. That's the challenge. Each business is different. Yeah. Okay,
that's fine. Great, thanks, John. And then Chris, if I come to this next question for you, we are a forestry contractor and carry out a large amount of tree planting for clients. We purchase trees from a supplier in this country who has them shipped from Europe. Can you please clarify who banks carbon credit for the planting, and where does our accountability start and end in terms of the emissions created during the transportation of the trees and processes of planting? If we cannot bank the carbon reduction credit for planting, are we still responsible for the carbon cost of planting?
No.
That's an amazing question. I'm going to do a Boris here and pass that over to Chris who can give you an answer, because offsets is definitely John's domain more than mine. So good luck with that one, John, but great question. And that's just a real sense of how complex this can get.
Yeah, I mean, I'm struggling to actually remember the detail of the question. It was so complicated. Yeah, it's a fantastic question. Yeah. And the short answer to that is that really is impossible to know without digging into it. I don't want to say, oh yeah, you can, or no, you can't, because without digging into it, I mean, you've seen Scope 3, it's so complicated. So without knowing the detail of that particular thing, it really is impossible to answer, James. Yeah, you just can't. I mean, what I would suggest is ask the what was his name? Sorry.
It's anonymous, but just to break it down very simply. So somebody grows a tree in Europe, ships it over to England and pass it to another company who then plant it in England. where do the emissions start and end for that transport? That journey?
If you're talking about the transport.
I think so. Yeah, that's my understanding of it.
Okay. So I kind of seemed that we're asking, like Chris said, about the offsets or something. That's what I kind of got. Well, the transport would sit. So if the company that's shipping it over, the transport would sit in their scope 3. The company that's selling it, it would sit in it would be their scope 1, because they would be paying for the transport in their scope 1. Yeah. So it really depends on who's picking up the bill. That would be one question. Yeah. So who's assuming risk? When does that get handed over? Is it freight on board? Is it ex-factory? So that might define where that sits. But in simple terms, yeah, if he's buying it, so if you think about the upstream and downstream, yeah, that's effectively his product that he's buying in. Yeah. So that would be his scope 3. Yeah.
Right.
It might also be the other company's scope 1. What would it be? It would be possibly the other, depends. Yeah, that would definitely would be his scope 3. Definitely would be his scope 3. Yeah. Right. In terms of how much of it would be his would depend on where that handover point was when it became his. Because there's different types of shipping methods. There's freight on board, there's ex-factory, there's another one where it's handed over when it gets to the far end of the country. So depending when it was handed over, he took ownership of it, would depend on where how much of that journey was in his scope 3.
Great. Okay. So as much about ownership as anything. Yeah, that's fine. Look, we've run to time. That's been really great and really insightful. John and Chris, thank you so much for your time. It's really great just to hear from you guys on this. And like I said, it's complex stuff. But to everyone who's attended, we will share the slides out with you. And of course, John and Chris's details are in there, so do get in touch with them, connect with them on LinkedIn, send them an email, etc. if you'd like to know more or have some more specific questions that you want to ask. So yeah, thank you so much for joining the FSB with this. And we hope to see you again for another webinar soon. Thank you.
Thanks for attending, guys.
I think that's everybody, guys. You there?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mia.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, breathing. Right, yeah, that's everybody.
Went really well.
Right, yeah. Sorry a bit about that beginning bit because I asked you to mute your cameras. I couldn't find you, so I couldn't spotlight you, James.
I can't wait for it to come
on. Disappeared off
like,
my screen.
I was like,
I couldn't find any of you. It's horrendous. So
I was confused because I thought, I can see John, but I can't see any slides. I thought, is this how it's supposed to work as a panelist? Obviously, Layla put her message in, and I went, okay, right. So
I didn't